The wedding dress was worth more than most families earned in an entire year. Ivory silk shimmered softly in the golden light of the room. Fine lace from France wrapped gently around the sleeves and neckline. Pearls were sewn carefully across the bodice. Ara had counted them herself, while the seamstresses worked for months. There were 47 pearls, each one placed by hand, each one shining like a tiny star whenever she moved. The long train flowed behind her like a cloud. It had been so wide and heavy that 3 bridesmaids had carried it down the aisle at St. James's Church earlier that day. Ara had felt like a queen. All her life she had imagined this moment. As a little girl, she had dreamed of wearing white silk and walking toward the man she loved. Today that dream had come true. Julian Alaric had returned to London after years away, and he had chosen her. The ceremony had been magnificent. 200 of the most powerful families in London had filled the church. Gentlemen in dark coats and ladies in bright gowns had watched as Ara walked slowly down the aisle toward the most handsome man in the room. Julian had looked at her with such intensity that her heart had nearly stopped beating. His dark eyes had seemed full of devotion. When he spoke his vows, his voice had been deep and emotional. Several women in the church had wiped tears from their eyes because the moment looked so beautiful. Ara had believed every word he said. After the ceremony, their carriage had carried them through the streets of London to his grand townhouse in Mayfair. The house stood tall and elegant among the finest homes in the city. Tall windows looked out onto the quiet street, and polished stone steps led to heavy wooden doors. It was the home of a powerful man. The servants had welcomed them inside before quietly disappearing as instructed. Soon, the entire house had become silent. Now Ara stood in the center of Julian's private drawing room. She was still wearing the wedding dress. Her cheeks still glowed from the joy of the ceremony. Her heart beat with excitement and nervous happiness as she waited for her husband to come closer to her. This was the moment she had imagined for years, the beginning of their life together. Julian closed the door behind them slowly. The sound of the lock turning echoed softly through the room. Ara turned toward him with a shy smile, but the moment she saw his face, something inside her went cold. The warmth that had filled his eyes at the church had vanished. The man standing in front of her now looked completely different. His face was hard, his expression distant and unreadable. The tenderness she had seen all day had disappeared, as if it had never existed. He walked toward her slowly. Then he stopped several feet away. "Take off the wedding dress," he said. His voice was cold and sharp. "This marriage is not about love." Ara blinked in confusion. For a moment she thought she had misunderstood him. "What?" she whispered. "You heard me," Julian replied calmly. His eyes moved over the dress with quiet indifference. "That dress was a costume," he continued. "And so were you. Everything you saw today was a performance. The ceremony, the vows, the smiles, all of it." Ara felt the room begin to spin. Julian turned away from her and walked toward the fireplace, as if nothing important had happened. "Every word I spoke to you was carefully planned," he said. "Every smile was calculated. Every moment of kindness was simply part of the act." Ara's fingers tightened around the silk of her dress. "Julian," she said softly. "Do not address me that way," he interrupted. His voice was icy. "You will call me the Marquis." He turned to face her again. "You are Lady Alara now by law," he said. "You will wear the title. You will appear beside me in public when necessary, but understand something clearly. This marriage is not a gift." "It is a prison." Ara stared at him, unable to breathe. "Why?" she asked quietly. Julian's lips curved into a faint and bitter smile. This marriage is revenge. The words hung in the air like a storm. Your father destroyed my family, Julian said. He accused my father of crimes that ruined his reputation and destroyed our name. The scandal forced my father into disgrace. It forced me into exile. His eyes darkened, and now I have taken something from him in return. Ada felt tears begin to gather in her eyes. You married me to punish him? You were the perfect choice, Julian replied coldly. The daughter of the man who destroyed my life, delivered to me by your own foolish hope. Ara's knees trembled beneath the weight of the dress. For years, she had loved him quietly from a distance. She had first seen Julian when she was only 8 years old. He had been 13 then, walking alone through the gardens during a summer gathering at her father's country estate. Even as a boy, he had seemed different from the others. Quiet, thoughtful, carrying a sadness that no child should carry. She had watched him from behind a stone wall without speaking to him. Something in her young heart had recognized his loneliness. Over the years, she had seen him again at different events in London. Each time he had grown more handsome, more distant, more mysterious. Without realizing it, she had fallen deeply in love with him. But when she was 16, the scandal had destroyed everything. Julian's father, the Duke of Ashbourne, had been accused of stealing large amounts of money from powerful investors. The accusation had shocked all of London. The man who had brought forward the evidence was Ara's own father, the Earl of Varron. Within weeks, the Duke's fortune was gone, his reputation destroyed. 3 weeks later, he had taken his own life. Julian had disappeared from London soon after, sent away to the continent, while his family name became a symbol of disgrace. Ada had watched him leave the city with tears in her eyes. For years, she had carried the heavy guilt of believing that her own father had caused his suffering. And then, 12 years later, Julian had returned. He had rebuilt his fortune through business and clever investments. He had reclaimed his title as Marquis. Society welcomed him back with fascination. When he saw Ara again at a ball in Belgravia, something had seemed to change in his eyes. He began visiting her family home. He walked with her in the gardens. He whispered that he had never forgotten her. Ara had believed every word. She had never imagined that every moment had been carefully planned. Now she stood in the middle of his drawing room, wearing a wedding dress that suddenly felt like chains. Julian looked at her one last time. You will learn to live with this arrangement, he said calmly. Society will see a perfect marriage, but between us, there will be nothing. Ada slowly lowered her eyes. The pearls on her dress caught the light again as a tear slid quietly down her cheek. The wedding dress that had once felt like a dream now felt like the beginning of a nightmare. The first week of the marriage passed in silence. The grand townhouse in Mayfair was filled with expensive furniture, tall windows, and quiet hallways. But Ada had never felt so alone in her life. Julian had made the rules clear on the very first night, and he followed them without exception. In public, they looked perfect. When they attended dinners in Belgravia or evening gatherings in Mayfair, society saw a handsome marquis and his beautiful young wife. Julian placed his hand gently at her back when they entered a room. He spoke to her politely. He smiled when others were watching. People admired them. Women whispered about how romantic their marriage seemed. Men spoke with respect about how Julian had returned from exile and rebuilt his life so successfully. But the moment they returned home, the illusion ended. Ara lived in a separate wing of the townhouse. 3 rooms had been assigned to her, a bedroom with tall curtains and a large bed she slept in alone. a quiet sitting room with a small fireplace, and a dressing room filled with expensive gowns chosen by Julian's staff. The rest of the house belonged to him. She had been given a document during the second morning of their marriage, a formal contract prepared by lawyers. The instructions were simple and cold. She would attend social events when Julian required it. She would wear the gowns selected for her. She would behave with dignity in public. She would not question his work, his travels, or his private life. One day she would produce an heir. In return, she would receive a generous allowance and the title of Marchioness. It was a life that looked perfect from the outside. Inside, it was empty. Julian rarely spoke to her. When they passed each other in the hallway, he nodded politely, as if greeting a stranger. When they attended events together, he offered his arm with careful politeness. But the moment they returned home, he disappeared into his study or left the house entirely. The cruelty was not loud. It was quiet and constant. It was the way he never used her name. He referred to her only as the Marchioness. It was the way he looked through her rather than at her. It was the way he treated her like an object placed inside his life rather than a person. Ara endured it quietly. There was no one she could speak to about it. Society would never believe her if she told them the truth. A woman's unhappiness in marriage was considered normal. It was something she was expected to endure without complaint. So she lived her days in silence. 3 months passed. One cold winter afternoon, Ara sat alone in her sitting room, going through a small collection of papers that had belonged to her father. Her father had died shortly before her wedding. The loss had been painful, but the excitement of the marriage had kept her from examining his belongings closely. Now she slowly opened the envelopes and letters he had left behind. Most were simple documents about family matters or estate records. Then she found one envelope that was different. It had no seal. Her father's handwriting covered the front. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was a single letter. My dearest Ara, if you are reading this, it means I am gone. I write this because there is something you must know, a truth I have carried alone for many years. Ara's heart began to beat faster. The letter continued. Your father was not the man the world believes him to be. The scandal that destroyed the Duke of Ashbourne was never my choice. I was forced into it. I was blackmailed. Ara stared at the words in disbelief. The letter explained that years earlier, someone had threatened her life when she was still a child. If her father refused to sign false testimony against the Duke, she would be harmed. He had been given no choice. To protect his daughter, he had allowed the lie to destroy another family. Ara's breathing became uneven. The letter ended with careful instructions. The truth, her father wrote, could be found in the government archives in Westminster, a specific document sealed with a particular aristocratic crest. You will recognize the seal, he had written, and when you see it, you will understand everything. Ara read the letter 3 times. Her entire life, she had believed her father had been responsible for Julian's suffering. But what if the truth was different? What if her father had been forced into the betrayal? What if someone else had planned the entire scandal? She needed answers. But reaching the archives without Julian knowing would not be easy. For 2 weeks she planned carefully. One morning, she told Julian she would attend a charity luncheon with several women from society. He barely looked up from his papers when she spoke. Very well, he said. Ara left the house shortly after noon. Instead of going to the luncheon, she traveled to Westminster. The House of Lords Record Office was a large stone building filled with long halls and quiet rooms where old documents were kept. An older archivist greeted her kindly when she explained she was researching records connected to her father's work. He remembered her father and seemed sympathetic. Soon, she found herself surrounded by shelves of old ledgers and sealed documents. She searched for hours. Her fingers grew cold from touching dusty papers. Her eyes grew tired from reading old handwriting. Then, suddenly, her body felt strange. A sharp chill ran through her. Her head spun. She tried to stand, but her knees weakened beneath her. The last thing she felt was the cold stone floor against her cheek before darkness took her. When Ara opened her eyes again, she was lying in her bed at the townhouse. Soft light filled the room. Her head felt heavy. For a moment, she could not understand how she had returned home. Then she noticed someone sitting beside the bed. Julian. He looked different. His coat was wrinkled. His dark hair was slightly disordered. His eyes were shadowed, as if he had not slept. For 3 days, Ara drifted in and out of fever. And during those days, Julian never left the room. He refused help from the servants. He brought her warm broth himself. He pressed cool cloths to her forehead when the fever burned too hot. Sometimes she pretended to sleep while he sat quietly beside her bed. Once she heard him whisper something softly. "Please don't leave me again." The words were filled with pain. For a brief moment, Ara heard the voice of the boy she had loved years ago, the boy who had lost everything. But when the fever finally faded, and Ara opened her eyes fully, Julian had returned to his usual cold self. His expression became distant again. The wall between them returned. Still, something inside Ara had changed. She could not forget what she had heard. And she could not forget the letter in her father's handwriting. As soon as she regained her strength, Ara returned to the archives. This time she searched with determination. 3 hours passed before she finally found the document. The seal stamped into the paper made her heart stop. It was the crest of the Dowager Duchess of Ashbourne, Julian's mother. Ara's hands shook as she opened the document and began to read. And within seconds, she realized something that would change everything. Ara's hands trembled as she read the document again. The seal on the paper was clear and unmistakable. It belonged to the Dowager Duchess of Ashbourne, Julian's own mother. The document was dated 2 years before the great scandal that had destroyed the Alaric family. It was a statement written to accuse Ara's father of financial crimes connected to the Duke of Ashbourne's investments. But something about it felt wrong. The handwriting in the statement was stiff and unnatural. The sentences sounded forced, almost like someone had dictated them. Then Ara saw the final line written neatly beneath the signature. "The child remains unharmed as promised." The elegant handwriting below the sentence carried the Duchess's signature. Ara felt the air leave her lungs. Her father had been telling the truth. He had been forced to sign a false confession because someone had threatened his daughter's life. The person behind the threat had been Julian's mother. Ara sat there in the quiet archive room as the truth settled over her like a storm. The Duchess had ruined her own husband to protect herself. She had destroyed the Duke's reputation before his financial mistakes could expose her own secret dealings. To make the lie believable, she had blackmailed Ara's father and forced him to accuse the Duke. The Duke had died believing his closest friend had betrayed him. Julian had spent 12 years believing Ara's father had destroyed his family. 12 years building a life around revenge. Ara slowly folded the document and placed it back in its protective cover. She had the proof in her hands, but revealing the truth would destroy Julian's mother forever, and it would force Julian to accept that his entire life had been built on a lie. That same evening, she waited for him in his study. The room was dark except for the light of the fireplace when Julian entered. He stopped immediately when he saw her sitting behind his desk. You are in my study, he said coldly. You should leave. No, Otto replied quietly. Something in her voice made him pause. What is it? He asked. Otto placed the documents on the desk. The truth, she said. Julian's eyes narrowed. He walked slowly toward the desk and picked up the papers. For several minutes, the room remained silent except for the crackling of the fire. Julian read the documents once. Then he read them again. The color slowly drained from his face. This cannot be real, he whispered. It is, Otto said softly. The archivist confirmed it. The seal is genuine. Julian sank into the chair behind the desk, as if the strength had left his body. My father was innocent, he said quietly. Yes. And your father? He was forced to lie. Julian stared at the floor. 12 years, he murmured. I spent 12 years believing your father destroyed my family. I built everything around that belief. He looked at Otto with broken eyes. And I destroyed you because of it. Before Otto could speak, the door suddenly opened. A tall woman stood in the doorway wearing dark silk. The Dowager Duchess. Her face was pale with fury. How dare you bring these lies into this house? She said sharply. Julian stood slowly. They are not lies, he replied. He held up the document with her seal. You blackmailed an innocent man. You destroyed my father. You destroyed my life. The Duchess's expression hardened. I did what was necessary to protect this family, she said. You destroyed this family, Julian answered quietly. He walked to the door and opened it. Leave this house, he said. The Duchess stared at him in shock. You cannot dismiss me. I can, Julian said firmly. You will return to the country estate immediately, and you will not return. The Duchess left without another word. When the door closed, Julian turned slowly toward Otto. His voice trembled. I cannot undo what I did to you, he said. I used you for revenge. I treated you like an enemy when you had done nothing wrong. Otto looked at him silently. I am sorry, Julian continued. I built my entire life on hatred. And in doing so, I became the very monster I believed destroyed my father. The truth soon reached the House of Lords. Julian presented the evidence before a special panel. Historians examined the documents. Experts confirmed the seal and handwriting. When the Duchess was questioned, she eventually confessed. The judgment was swift. Her position in society was destroyed. She was forced into exile at a remote estate in Scotland. Ara's father was publicly declared innocent, and his name was cleared after years of disgrace. Justice had finally been done. But the scandal did not end quietly. Before leaving London, the Duchess spoke to the newspapers. She revealed Julian's original plan for revenge and the truth about the cold marriage he had forced upon Ara. Within days, London society turned against them. Ara became an object of pity. Julian became a man condemned for cruelty. To end the scandal, the Crown granted them something rare, an annulment. The marriage was declared invalid because it had been created under false intentions. Ara was free. She could leave and begin a new life. Julian expected exactly that. One evening, he found her standing in the quiet garden behind the townhouse. The annulment is complete, he said softly. You are free now. I know, Otto replied. Then why are you still here? Otto looked at him calmly. Because I remember the boy I saw when I was 8 years old, she said. The boy who was lonely in the garden. Julian looked down. You should hate me. I do, she said honestly. You hurt me deeply. I cannot forgive that yet. She stepped closer. But I also saw the man who chose the truth, even when it destroyed everything he believed. Julian's eyes filled with tears. I do not deserve another chance. No, Ara said gently. You do not. She paused. But I am willing to give you one. Julian stared at her in disbelief. A real chance, she continued. Not a marriage built on revenge or obligation. A choice. What are you asking? He whispered. Ara smiled softly. I am asking if you would marry me again. This time, honestly. Julian's voice broke. I would spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that. Several months later, they married again in a small country church far away from London. There were no crowds and no reporters. Ara wore a simple blue silk gown instead of the grand white dress from her first wedding. Julian stood beside her with quiet humility. When the ceremony ended, he placed a delicate cameo pin at her collar. It belonged to your mother, he said softly. I once took it thinking I owned you. Now I return it to remind myself that you chose to be here. Ara smiled through tears. Their second kiss felt completely different. It was not built on lies. It was the beginning of something real. A year later, they lived peacefully at a quiet estate in the countryside. Ara had started a foundation in her father's name to help clear the names of innocent people falsely accused of crimes. Julian spent his days learning slowly how to live without anger. The beautiful wedding dress from their first marriage was placed away forever. Instead, Ara kept the simple blue gown from their second ceremony. A reminder that sometimes the greatest love is not the one that begins perfectly. It is the one rebuilt from truth, forgiveness, and the courage to start again.